Fact: in 1865, a 47-year-old man was committed to a mental asylum after a nervous breakdown. In the asylum, he was brutally beaten by the orderlies and contracted gangrene, dying of sepsis not long after. Ironically, this man was one of the fathers of germ theory, whose new methods saved hundreds of lives and could have saved more had he been listened to instead of being treated like a lunatic. His name was Ignas Ignas, and he was born in 1818 to a German family in Hungary. Fun fact: at the time that Semmelweis was practicing medicine, the medical field was dominated by the ancient Greek philosophy of miasma. Miasma theory claims that bad smells can transfer illness, and conversely, good smells and good ventilation can keep illness away. Scientists pointed to how cholera outbreaks tended to happen most commonly in big crowded cities, which smelled bad. Therefore, bad smells equals bad health. When Ignas became a doctor in the maternity ward of the Vienna General Hospital, he made a startling discovery that flipped the medical world on its head. More women were dying of childbed fever in the ward staffed by doctors than in the ward staffed by midwives. Like any good scientist, Ignas set out to find out why. No theory was too out there. He had the women give birth on their sides like they did in the midwives' clinic. He had the priests stop the practice of ringing bells while the women were in labor, but all of this had no effect on the mortality rate. He made his breakthrough when a pathologist colleague of his died after performing an autopsy on one of the women from the maternity ward. Ignas put two and two together and realized the big difference between the two wards was that doctors were performing autopsies and midwives were not. He theorized that particles of the corpses were being transferred to the women via the doctor's hands and implemented a strict regimen of hand washing with chlorine to remove any particles and any lingering miasma. After doing so, the death rate dropped dramatically. Despite this seemingly great outcome, Ignas made some serious enemies in the medical establishment. Many doctors had their egos terminally bruised by the implication that midwives were better at managing childbirth than they were, and the implication that doctors could be infecting their patients. Soon, the hand washing stopped and Ignas was fired, something he would never recover from, until his ultimate end at the Lazaretgasse insane asylum. It took 20 years after his death for Louis Pasteur to prove germ theory and for hand washing to become a requirement at all hospitals. If people had listened to Ignas Semmelweis sooner, who knows how many lives could have been saved. Semmelweis' work is now celebrated. He even got a Google Doodle in 2020 at the height of COVID-19 to honor his work in promoting sanitation. But for decades, he remained a footnote in history when, by all accounts, he should have been a hero. Hero is a word synonymous with ticker tape parades, medal ceremonies, and monuments dedicated to great deeds. But sometimes, great deeds go unrewarded, and for every Davy Crockett that gets a ballad written about them, there are heroes who enter and exit history with their songs largely unsung. Today, we dive into the weird world of heroes you've probably never heard of. In 1985, Shavar Karapetan, a professional fin swimmer from Armenia, then part of the Soviet Union, ran into a burning building to help rescue multiple people from the flames. He ended up in the hospital with life-threatening injuries, and for most people, this would have been a once-in-a-lifetime moment of heroism, but for Shavar, it was his third. Fun fact: just a few years earlier, he was riding a bus when the driver stopped to check the engine, and while he did, the bus started to roll towards a steep cliff. Shavar sprung into action and broke the partition that separated the driver from the rest of the passengers and steered the bus to safety. This was just an appetizer for his true crowning moment of heroism. On September 16, 1976, a trolley bus traveling along the edge of a dam on Lake Yerevan lost control and plummeted into the water, sinking fast. Shavar had just finished working out by the lake, completing an 18-mile run while carrying a 40-pound sandbag on his back, and saw the whole thing. He dove into the water, which at the time was freezing cold and cloudy with sewage and silt. Despite this, he swam 80 feet into the lake and 33 feet down, kicking in the back window of the trolley bus and slicing his legs open in the process. He dove down to the bus 20 times, pulling out 37 people, while 9 other people swam to the surface by themselves through the window he had kicked in. Shavar continued to dive down to the bus until he was stopped by the rescue crew, as he was fading quickly, due to the blood loss from the cuts on his legs and the freezing cold water. Despite his efforts, only 20 of the 46 people he saved from the bus managed to survive after enduring the toxic conditions of the lake. Shavar was taken to the hospital where the cuts on his legs became dangerously infected, and he spent the next month and a half hospitalized. He developed pneumonia, sepsis, and damaged lungs, which would ruin his swimming swimming career. Not to mention the psychological aspects. He became unable to stay underwater for any period of time due to the nausea from memories of that day. You would think this would be front-page news, but unfortunately, the Soviet Union at the time suppressed any stories of tragedy within the country to save face, because bad things didn't happen in the Soviet Union. So they hid the story, and Shavar went on to live a normal life. It wasn't until 1982 that the story became well known within the Soviet Union and the rest of the world. Not even his family knew about his acts of heroism until the story leaked to the wider world. He never even told his wife about it. But this doesn't keep the very alive Shavar down though. He now runs a show company and lives in quiet retirement. He's quoted saying, "Anyone can find himself in a place where someone needs help, and more than once too. The main thing is to remember what makes you human." The My Lai massacre is remembered today as one of the worst atrocities committed by the US Army. In total, 500 civilians would be killed by members of Task Force Barker, an army group tasked with rooting out the Viet Cong in the village of Sun Mai in South Vietnam. The company entered the village and began shooting anyone they saw, man, woman, or child, without hesitation. The vast majority of these killings were civilians. Fact: Hugh Thompson was a helicopter pilot for B Company Aero Scouts at the time. On March 16th, he was sent to provide air cover for Task Force Barker. When he landed near the area, he found a group of injured civilians. Lieutenant Thompson lit flares by them to indicate they needed rescue, but when he returned from his patrol, he found them all dead. He did the same thing again when he found another injured civilian, only this time, he stuck around to see what would happen, and was shocked to see his fellow soldiers approach and kill the woman in cold blood. Thompson realized then he was in the middle of a US-run massacre. He confronted one of the instigators of the massacre, Lieutenant William Calley, who told him he was just following orders. Thompson and his crew stood in their way and forced them to stand down, saving the civilians with the help of 2 Huey helicopter escorts. Because of Thompson's scathing report on My Lai, military activity in the area was suspended, saving countless more lives. The military tried to cover up the massacre. They declared that Task Force Barker's mission was successful and swept it under the rug. But it was only a matter of time before the truth got out, and the horrors of My Lai were made public. Thompson would testify before the Senate, where he was harshly criticized by members of Congress who wanted to downplay the massacre. He would be vilified for what he did, receiving countless death threats. It would only be years after the war that he would be acknowledged for his heroism, and was given the Soldier's Medal, the highest award for bravery not involving contact with the enemy, in 1998. In World War I, the US Army was heavily segregated, with separate black and white divisions. At the start of the war, there were 4 black regiments, and they were forced to do mostly labor jobs like building roads. There was also a hard ceiling on how high black soldiers could climb through the ranks of the army. Private Henry Johnson enlisted into the army in 1917 and was designated to the 369th Infantry, nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters. Fact: the 369th, like most regiments, had only white officers. When they arrived on the Western Front in France, the 369th discovered that most of their white countrymen refused to fight alongside them. The all-black regiments suffered harassment and denigration until they were loaned out to work with the French army. In May 1918, Private Johnson found himself in Champagne, the region not the drink, looking out at the Argonne Forest. He was on an observational post with fellow soldier Private Needham Roberts, and in the dead of night, they fell under enemy fire from a surprise raiding group of as many as 36 German soldiers. Outnumbered, the 2 privates fought heroically for their lives. When Needham was injured badly, Johnson prevented the Germans from taking him and fought by himself, hand to hand with the Germans. Using only his fists and a bolo knife, he fought back the Germans, killing 4 and injuring several more. He got the nickname the Black Death because of it. He became the first American to receive the Croix de Guerre, the highest honor presented to non-French soldiers at the time. However, when he returned home, he received a far more chilly reception. He received no medals from the US Army, only a parade, which was also segregated, and he returned to life as a second-class citizen, cashing in a small pension until his early death in 1929. Private Henry Johnson wouldn't receive any real recognition until almost 100 years later, when he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor by President Obama in 2015. The end of the citation reads, "Private Johnson's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service, and he reflects great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army." If a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? For a lot of these unsung heroes, there were plenty of people around, but whether because of ignorance, guilt, or prejudice, they went ignored by the mainstream. Despite this, their names and stories were preserved by the people that knew them and the people they saved. We can only hope that we can be smart enough to make sure that future heroes don't go unsung.